What could the path to peace for Ukraine look like? The debate over possible scenarios for ending the war is heating up as President-elect Donald Trump prepares to take office in Washington. He has vowed to end the war quickly. Ukraine is under heavy pressure from intense waves of Russian attacks, despite promises of more weapons from Germany and the US. Trump's designated special envoy for Ukraine, General Keith Kellogg, has a plan to bring Ukraine and Russia to the negotiating table. But will Putin even consider it? President Zelenskyy may have to pay a high price for peace, especially if he wants to get the NATO protection he hopes for by temporarily giving up some territories. On To The Point, we ask, war and peace, a deal with Putin at the expense of Ukraine? Welcome to this week's To The Point. I'm Javier Arguedas. It's good to have you with us. Let's meet today's guests. Rafael is an expert on defense and security policy, military operations, and arms control with the European Council on Foreign Relations. Thomas Wiegold is a journalist and military blogger specialized in defense and security policy and the German Bundeswehr here in Berlin. And Marina Miron is a military analyst with King's College London, joining us from the city of Munich. To all of you, welcome and thank you for being here today. Thomas, I'd like to start with you. November just saw the worst losses for Ukraine since 2022. What is the current state of the war?
Well, the war, some people even say Ukraine is in a position which is deteriorating by the day. Obviously, the number of weapons, the number of ammunition delivered is not enough. But what's worse is that Ukraine is running into problems with personnel. Not enough soldiers, high attrition rate, high losses, which mean in the end it's a question of time in the current situation, if it goes on like this, whether Ukraine can keep and hold its position.
Despite the gains from the Russian military, Marina, the situation isn't good for Russia either. Why is the war costing so many lives to the Russian military?
Well, the problem is that the Russians use attrition as their strategy, and obviously it is very manpower intensive. They have high losses. That being said, they don't have the same problem that Ukraine has. And these high losses, we don't know the exact number. And there are some estimates of how many casualties the Russians have suffered. The Russian military can absorb it. I think the problem here is not so much Ukraine, but now the war being revived in Syria and the possible necessity to deploy some of the Russian troops to Syria. And so the dilemma here is, how do you best solve this problem in terms of, if you overtly deploy troops to Syria to lead the Syrian Arab Army Assault Corps, it will obviously weaken the Russian position in Ukraine. And Russia is now having the upper hand in Ukraine. It needs to conclude the Ukrainian campaign before it can overstretch its capabilities and deploy more forces to Syria. That's why we're seeing an increased use of air power, similar to what we have seen in October 2015, when the Russians entered the Syrian civil war. And so I think that is more of a dilemma rather than the lack of personnel per se or the high losses that the Russians are suffering in Ukraine.
That's one of the reasons why many say there is a defining moment for the war in Ukraine going on right now. Rafael, amid those developments, there is suddenly a lot of talk about a potential peace deal for Ukraine at this moment. Why do you think that is?
I mean, first of all, it's great to see talk about path towards a just peace in Ukraine. But what is a bit odd, though, is that on a nightly basis, we see talk about a path to Ukraine's surrender in Russian television. So there's a gap in perception as how audiences around the world look at this conflict. But we're moving into a direction that's been described by the co-panelists, where both sides are suffering tremendously, where Ukraine is under a lot of pressure, and where there's not really prospect, and we saw this coming out of the NATO Foreign Ministers Summit, of a substantial increase in Western military aid to Ukraine. even though that would be necessary to put Ukraine in a better negotiating position. But that is not on the horizon at the moment. And so the Ukrainian leadership, others are thinking about what potential pathways there could be towards a ceasing of hostilities and potentially a peace later on.
And certainly many are looking at one specific date, January 20th, when Donald Trump will take office. Retired U.S. General Keith Kellogg is set to become Trump's special envoy for Ukraine and Russia. At 80 years old, he, like the president-elect, aims to quickly end the Russian war against Ukraine and bring both sides to the negotiating table.
Here's what we know about the peace plan by Keith Kellogg, Trump's designated special envoy for Ukraine and Russia. The U.S. would supply more weapons to Kyiv to deter further Russian advances or future attacks, but that aid would only be provided if Ukraine is willing to negotiate, the goal being a peace agreement with security guarantees. Russia could receive guarantees that Ukraine will not become a NATO member for years to come. The plan calls for the freezing of front lines and the creation of a demilitarized zone under Russian leadership in eastern Ukraine. Ukraine would not have to officially give up occupied territories, but their status would need to be decided through negotiations, not armed conflict. President Zelenskyy has expressed a surprising willingness to compromise.
If we want to stop the hot stage of the war, we should take under NATO umbrella the territory of Ukraine that we have under our control. That's what we need to do fast. And then Ukraine can get back the other part of its territory diplomatically.
The Trump-Kellogg plan, a chance for peace, or has Ukraine already lost?
Rafael, you were talking about Ukraine surrendering before. Volodymyr Zelenskyy had always said that he was not willing to concede any part of its territory to Russia. What do you make of those latest statements where it appears, though, as he could in fact give up some part of its territory to achieve peace?
To be sure, Russia is aiming at Ukraine's surrender. I think nobody in the West is aiming in that direction, not at least the persons in responsible political positions. But to your question, I think that reflects a reality that the Ukrainian leadership is recognizing that through military force, it would be very difficult, particularly because there is no prospect of increased military aid at this point in time, to recapture, to liberate those occupied territories. And that a potential path to regaining them is diplomatic rather than military.
That is something that many would wish for, Thomas. The plan that we're seeing now could foresee freezing the front lines roughly as they are today. Do you think that's realistic? Could that work?
I'm not sure about this. The question is, freezing the front lines might have different meaning for the Ukrainians and for the Russians. And if Zelenskyy formally says, well, we could accept it, not giving up Ukrainian territory, which he cannot do by the Constitution. So formally not giving it up, but agreeing that it's under foreign control, under Russian control. I'm not sure whether this works because I'm not sure how the Russians will interpret this. This is part of, like the old German model during the Cold War, when West Germany, in a way, had still was thinking that Eastern Germany was basically part of Germany. It all turned out differently after 1989, but that was a similar construction with one main difference. There was no hot war.
Yeah, and now we have it.
Now we have a hot war.
And there is another very important sticking point in those potential negotiations, Marina. Words, not actions, is what we've seen when it comes to Ukraine joining NATO. We were hearing President Zelenskyy talking about a plan under the umbrella of NATO for protecting the territory. What could the alliance really be willing to provide to Ukraine in a potential peace deal?
Well, that's a very good question. First, I'd like to return briefly to the buffer zone. And so we've heard from the Ukrainian perspective, it's already a complicated matter to consider. From the Russian perspective, at least what the Russian media has been conveying so far is that they are not going to go for another Minsk agreement because it doesn't work. And the point here, especially in light of what is happening in Syria, the Russians are saying, now you see what happens if you freeze conflicts, if you freeze wars. It is only temporary, and hostilities will eventually break out. And so I'm not sure how far the Russians are willing to go in terms of freezing and creating a buffer zone there because of this distrust towards the West and the Western hostility is interpreted from the Russian point of view. And as far as what NATO can do, now, one part of Ukraine joining NATO, we have to think about the legal issues concerning the whole process of joining NATO. You have to be offered a membership action plan, and for that you also have to fulfill specific conditions which Ukraine in its present state doesn't fulfill. Therefore, the NATO's own statutes would have to be changed in order for this scenario to be implemented on the one hand, and on the other hand, this could create a precedent if Ukraine or part of Ukraine joins NATO. What would it mean for other potential countries that are seeking NATO membership? On the one hand, on the other hand, what is NATO willing to deploy to Ukraine in order to monitor this buffer zone, in order to ensure that if there is a ceasefire, that both sides keep the ceasefire? And that is a big question. And of course, from the Russian perspective, this would be then station its soldiers right on Russia's borders in Ukraine, and possibly long-range weapon systems operated by NATO personnel. So I see it.
I think we briefly lost Marina there, but she was talking about what could be considered red lines for Vladimir Putin, the contrary actually to what he is demanding. Thomas, there are also red lines here in Europe and here in Germany that we've seen crossed time and time again. Ukraine joining NATO was something Germany has been hesitant to accept or to support so far. Do you see that changing in case there are these negotiations taking place?
No, I don't see this changing at the moment. The impression is that Germany is looking pretty straightforward at the precondition that a country joining NATO is not actually in a war engaged somewhere. It's like you don't get insurance when your house is already burning. So this won't work, I think. And the other point, which makes me very, very skeptical about this Trump-Kellogg plan, is this would mean NATO troops deploying, right, as Marina already mentioned, right on the Russian border. And that's something Putin always wanted to avoid. In fact, that's why he went to war. So why would you offer him, or why do you even expect him to agree to a ceasefire, which means you have this very NATO presence you despise?
That's one important question and more important aspect. The other is the fact that there have to be consequences in the best of cases for a country invading another. Thomas, despite the fact that this would cause Putin to have, for example, NATO troops right on his border, it would also be a, let's say, light exit from the point of view of consequences. But what would that mean for the European security architecture? Russia learning the lesson that invading another country will not necessarily mean any type of very hard punishment.
I think that goes to the core of the dilemma that policymakers in Europe face, trading short-term risks associated with Ukraine's NATO membership, for example, with long-term risks that are associated with not inviting Ukraine into the alliance or offering other kinds of security guarantees to it. We would have a frozen, somewhat semi-hot conflict going on in Europe that could proliferate to other countries. Moldova comes to mind. And so if we don't solve this problem from a European perspective, then we'll have to face a much bigger problem, I think, over the medium to long term, and that Russia has continued interest in meddling in European affairs, and one more tool to do that through Ukraine.
When we talk about Ukraine, we also can't forget the people of Ukraine and the military specifically. Marina, What does it mean if we see Ukraine ceding territory to Russia, something that has been a no-go for a large part of the Ukrainian population and also for the Ukrainian military? Would that put an end to Volodymyr Zelenskyy as the country's leader, do you think?
Well, that's a very good question, because we need to look at President Zelensky's ratings, especially since May of this year, because obviously Ukraine should have had elections. And from my understanding and following also the Ukrainian media, his ratings have fallen. He has fallen in popularity, especially if you compare it to General Valery Zaluzhny. And so I have the sensation that Ukrainian people are becoming tired, and we're seeing it also in terms of the recruitment, the military recruitment that is not working out as planned. So it seems that they are much more willing to accept an end to the conflict, whatever it looks like, just to stop this war and just to stop whatever is going on in Ukraine, because it's not just the war that's plaguing the people, but also the economic situation. Ukraine's economy is completely destroyed. And so, yes, I think should there be any sort of ceasefire, even Western allies would probably exert pressure on Ukraine to hold general elections, to hold presidential elections, for people to choose who their next leader will be. And that will certainly determine the further course of where Ukraine will land politically.
It seems as though none of you really think this peace plan could be very promising, despite the fact that Donald Trump has vowed to end the war very quickly. What happens if there is no peace plan and no agreement in the next few months, Thomas?
Well, the war will go on. It will be a terrible price Ukraine will have to pay, unless the Europeans might be willing and might be able to step in with more weapons, more ammunition. Obviously, they can't replace the people, the soldiers, but at least if the Europeans try to replenish Ukrainian stocks, there might be a better chance. And still we are talking about European long-range weapons. The Taurus again comes to mind, which the German Chancellor again repeatedly says he won't deliver. So we'll see what happens after the German elections in February. That might change things, but I'm not sure in the short term how this will work out.
It seems as though the European NATO allies don't really have a plan. Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, just announced 650 million euros in additional aid to Ukraine.
That's not additional, excuse me. That has been pledged before. He mentioned it again when he was in Kiev.
All right, okay, but they haven't been delivered so far.
Hasn't been delivered, but has been pledged already.
Okay. But he announced that it will be delivered now. That means an additional, not additional, but a formerly promised military aid. However, these amounts are not as high as we saw in other parts or episodes of this war. Do you think the politicians are still doing the mistake that everyone has been signaling from the beginning, that is just giving dribs and drags and help to Ukraine, and that this will continue until Trump takes office?
I think it will. The material reality is that we haven't built up European defense industry to the degree that we could now significantly increase what we provide to Ukraine and backfilling our own stockpiles. That is a decision that we should have taken two and a half years ago, and we didn't. If we take that decision now, and there are some hints that the Defense Ministry, the Ministry for Economic Affairs, take this issue quite seriously, then it would still take a couple of months, if not years, for aid to arrive. So this is a very precarious situation, coupled with the political instability that we have in Germany because of early elections, in France because of collapsing coalition government, and in the United States with the transition to the Donald Trump administration. This is a really tough situation for Ukraine, and I hardly see how this will improve over the short term.
We're going to briefly take a look at the situation in Russia, because the war-driven economic boom is starting to show its negative sides. The ruble has recently plummeted, labor shortages are becoming more acute, and inflation is on the rise.
Moscow's supermarkets may be full, but people are feeling the effects of rising inflation. At the end of November, the ruble fell to its lowest level against the US dollar since the beginning of the war.
The amount that we pay, from where we buy, is in US dollars. So we are really suffering because of it. What we used to pay, our cost itself is higher by 25% now, 25 to 30%.
Food prices have risen. That's just how it is. What can you do? We have no choice. We can't choose the times we live and die in. I choose to live with a sense of ease and joy. So far, many Russians have benefited from the war economy, which has created jobs, especially in the defense industry. But this economic stimulus is now reaching its limits. What's more, lower oil prices, new sanctions, and even higher inflation could push Russia into a recession. Putin would then find it more difficult to finance a conflict that is expected to cost more and more. How long can Russia afford this war?
We've certainly had that question before also in this show. It's been 1,000 days of war, and we've heard 1,000 wrong predictions about what would happen to Russia. Marina, is there any reason to believe the economy could limit Russia's performance on the ground?
Well, economy is a central mechanism here in order to enable military operations, because you have to finance them. But linking it back to the previous segment about NATO and NATO's capability in the European defense industry, yes, this is going to be difficult for Russia, and I'm not sure if it's a temporary issue with the fall of ruble, whether the central bank will be able to contain this or how this will evolve. It remains to be seen. There are some predictions that the Russian economy will be able to sustain the war for at least another 2 years. Now let's consider the European defense industry and how this plays out. Can European NATO members sustain supporting Ukraine for the next couple of years? And some of the problems have already been mentioned. I would like to also add the supply chain crisis and the growing prices for raw materials. So for European defense companies, they can produce, but they cannot produce the volumes that, say, the Russians or North Koreans can produce despite all the sanctions.
Yeah.
And so the question here becomes, can we, even with Russia's economy now in decline, can European NATO members compete with Russia while rearming themselves and also supporting Ukraine at the same time? And I think that should be considered from this angle in order to make a proper assessment.
An assessment that is difficult and has been from the beginning. Thomas, if there is no concise action by the European NATO countries, is there any way to still punish Russia through sanctions to somehow limit their military operations? It hasn't worked so far.
It hasn't worked so far, and the point is, well, how far can you go? How far are you willing to go? Quite obviously, despite the sanctions, Russia is delivering oil, is selling gas. So the question is, why does it not work? And what could the Europeans do? If you see the shadow fleet of tankers alone in the Baltic, you might ask, why do European countries not take action on that? There might be reasons. I could imagine if it worked, it would be the other way around. The Russians would have great ideas on environmental reasons or whatever to control these fleets. The Europeans are not doing this for whatever reason. We had obviously a standoff between a Russian tanker and a German helicopter last week, where the Russians just fired not directly at the helicopter, but took all preconditions to scare it off. So how far are the Europeans willing to go? That's the question.
It has been from the beginning. We have time for one more question, Rafael. Do you think, considering what we just talked about, that we are in a tipping point for Ukraine? Or is this just one of many moments where people thought there was change coming and nothing really made a big difference?
fundamentally, it's really difficult to run counter scenarios, and that goes for the sanctions issue as well. If we hadn't implemented sanctions on Russian defense industry, on imports for microprocessors, for example, what the Russians have been able to produce many more missiles than they're currently using against Ukraine. And so this is a very difficult question to sort of conceptually grasp with, and I think it's too early to draw final conclusions.
We'll have to wait. Once again, thank you so much to all three of you for your analysis. And of course, thank you for watching. Remember, you can always rewatch this show on our YouTube channel. Just look for DW News and the latest To The Point episode. I'm Javier Arguedas here in Berlin. Until next time, take care and goodbye.